Let's have a look at what's happening to Brexit in the House of Lords. The first day of the Lords giving their opinions on the withdrawal bill in particular. Joining me is Barney, Scholes and Patrick Christys. And Patrick, let's start with you. The Lords in general, there's been a lot of noise made about how the Conservative Party are concerned because the presence of so many Liberal Democrat peers, Labour peers, about what's going to happen in terms of amendments now. It's it's hitting that second chamber. Are you worried about the possibility of things being bounced back from the Lords and certain caveats and amendments being put in place?
I think maybe it's the Lords that should be worried about the possibility of bouncing things back, because I think the will of the people has expressed itself. 17.4 million people votes to leave, and if the Lords start kind of stifling that process and maybe trying to reject it altogether, there'll be even more calls for the House of Lords perhaps to be abolished, and those calls have been mounting for some time now, and if they actively get in the way of the will of the public, then I think those calls will be mounting. So I'm not overly concerned. I think there'll be a lot of bluster in the Lords. I think that's what we've been seeing. I think there'll be a lot of hoo-ha, but I would be surprised, I could be wrong obviously, I would be surprised if they actually do go and try and bounce Brexit back.
I mean, there are several key issues which the Lords have highlighted, Henry VIII powers or Lord Adonis with his second referendum plea.
Yeah.
Barney, where do you see the Lords, where do you see the power of the Lords here? Are they going to be particularly irritant for Theresa May's government?
Well, certainly that, I think. But I think we've got to look at what the House of Lords is actually there for. I mean, you know, I have my own issues with the House of Lords as an institution, but what it is there for is as a body of experts in various areas to scrutinise legislation. They don't have the power to make legislation, they have the power to scrutinise legislation, to look through it and see, okay, where are the problematic areas, what are the issues with this particular piece of legislation, and then to advise the Commons to then have a look at this and see how they might be able to improve the legislation. So there are numerous constitutional issues with the bill, the EU withdrawal bill that's now going through the Lords. I think all kinds of questions about giving the executive, giving government ministers incredibly far-reaching powers to change laws behind closed doors without proper scrutiny. So I think it's absolutely right for the Lords to have a look at that and see whether there are areas that can be improved and be made better. So I think the Lords is fulfilling its primary duty, which is to properly scrutinise legislation. Let's
just pick up on something that's been said today by Conservative Lord Higgins. I think he's about 90 years old. He's called for a bill banning future referendums. It quotes as saying its previous Brexit referendum was the most sordid I have seen in my life. Patrick, something tells me that's not going to go particularly down well with you.
It's not a surprise. I mean, I'm surprised that he woke up long enough maybe to make that statement. I think in the Lords, is it a real shock that somebody who's an elected there would not want to have direct representation of the people? I'm not sure that it's that much of a shock. I mean, that's quite a terrible comment to make, really. You don't want any direct democracy, and maybe it's because he doesn't want a referendum on whether or not the House of Lords should exist.
I mean, it is a fair point in the sense of the referendum campaign has polarised more than it has unified. Arguably, 52%, 48%, and therefore, in terms of being politically helpful, finding a solution.
It's necessary to be able to have public discussions, and you have to have the belief in your strength of character as a nation to be able to have the type of discussion we're having today, where you can fundamentally disagree on several points, but you can go away and shake hands afterwards and everything's fine. You know, and to kind of nullify that in a nation is a bit dangerous, I think, really.
I mean, I'd certainly second. I've only heard about this from you, but I think there's a place for a referendum, for referenda, and yes, to say that we should entirely get rid of them is a bit of a blanket statement, I would say.
Noticeable though, particularly in that immediate aftermath after the referendum result, the Brexit. I mean, there was a very, very strong line of, well, a referendum should never have been called by David Cameron. That came a lot particularly from the Remain camp. Is that something?
Well, I think the argument that I would make in that case is David Cameron kind of sold the Brexit referendum as this is something that the country needs to have, that everybody is incredibly sort of already apparently incredibly divided over the issue of Europe, and therefore we need to have this referendum to solve this issue. The reality of it was nothing of the sort. It was a referendum that he called because he was worried about essentially UKIP stealing the right wing of the Conservative Party away from him, because obviously UKIP at that point were a rising force and getting a lot of votes, especially in European elections. So there was a fear within the Conservative Party, especially within the Conservative Party leadership, that UKIP was going to drain away support from the Conservative Party. So the reason he called that referendum was essentially to satisfy the right flank of the Conservative Party who've always been obsessed with banging on about Europe.
But surely the fact of the growth of UKIP was a result of the Euroscepticism and the discontentment with the current system.
I think
in place,
there were a lot of factors that went into why UKIP became such a, I mean, don't get me wrong, they're an incredibly successful single-issue party, arguably the most successful single-issue party in British political history. But there was a lot of factors that went into why they gained so much support, and I don't think deeply held Euroscepticism was the only factor in that. I think that if you actually did surveys of, if you spoke to people, you know, spoke to constituents around the country, spoke to regular members of the public, Europe, generally speaking, came incredibly low down people's list of priorities. Much more important was the NHS, public services, the economy, schools, you know, that kind of thing. So to say that the referendum was completely necessary, I think, is misleading.
But surely the fact it was 52%, 48%. I mean, prior to the referendum, the political convention was that British people probably would vote to remain. You know, that, and even to be honest, up until the referendum day itself, the referendum result changed that completely. It was a shock to many. So surely that did. You know, so referendums, sort of, I'm trying to get your point of referendums are important on basis just as long as they're not involving Europe.
No, not at all. That's not my point. I'm just saying that, I mean, things like there was a referendum on the alternative vote, for example. That was quite a useful tool of demonstrating general public support for changing the way the electoral system functioned in this country. So I think there is a time and a place for a referendum. I'm not at all saying that we can never have referendums. That's exactly the opposite of what I said, I think. But what I would say on the Brexit referendum is that it was called, as I said, mainly by David Cameron for political reasons, not for the good of the country.
Not for the good of the country. You obviously a champion of referendum. A second referendum, or at least a referendum on the deal, the actual reality of Brexit. Why is that such a bad thing then?
Well, I'm not necessarily saying that it is, actually. I think that the only way...
So a second referendum is a good idea?
Well, I think that the Leave camp are at risk of running scared from a second referendum when they don't need to, because what I would have a problem with a second referendum is if we go and get an absolutely terrible deal and it's a choice between that and nothing else. That's not a referendum at all. That's a deal. That's a choice between two terrible options. But at the minute, currently, I believe that a second referendum we would have nothing to fear from in the Leave campaign, because we've seen Jean-Claude Juncker call for an EU army. Now, no one in Britain would really want to be signed up to that. We've seen Martin Schulz call for United States of Europe by 2028. British people aren't going to want to be part of the United States of Europe, even some of the Remainers. So I don't think that Leave. I think the only question with regards to the second referendum would be how much Leave would win by, really.
But then that's quite interesting. Why don't we see Nigel Farage? Why don't we see Aaron Banks, some of the key faces of the Leave.eu campaign, but the Leave campaign nonetheless, calling for a second referendum?
Well, you have to ask them. I don't know. It's not up to me.
Well, Nigel Farage has said that he's starting to think
come out
that
and
there
said
should be a
he
second
certainly wouldn't.
referendum.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
and I think Aaron Banks came out and backed him on that, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I don't think they're opposed to it. I think largely for the same reasons that I'm saying. Because at the minute, what you see is the only people that seem to be calling for a second referendum are the Remain side, the likes of the Tony Blairs, and it makes it look like the Leave camp are running scared. There's a hugely credible case, if not a more credible case, I would argue, to leave the European Union now than there was even before the first referendum.
I think what you've got to look at is, rather than it being a second referendum in the sense of rerunning the first referendum, which I don't think is a particularly sensible idea, when we know clearly what the terms of Brexit are, when we can see this will be the direct consequences of Brexit, this is the deal that the government has negotiated for you, this will be the consequences for your community, for your job, for your public services, I think that people across the country have every right to have a say on that, whether that's through a referendum, whether that's through a general election, some other sort of democratic exercise. I can't see why there would be any debate about that being a sensible approach.
And with that, some consensus at least. Barney and Patrick, thank you very much for coming on.